Gresham College presents Apprenticeship in Early Modern London by Dr. Patrick Wallace and Dr. Christopher Minns.
Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Roderick Flood, Provost of the College, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you again, I'm sure, in the case of many of you, to Gresham. A particular pleasure this evening to welcome you to a lecture on my own subject of economic history. I've heard a preliminary version or another version of what you're going to hear from Patrick Wallace and Christopher Minns, and thought that their work on apprenticeship in early modern London very much related to Gresham, to the guilds of London and to the City of London, and this, as you know, is one of a series of lectures on the city. So they are both at the London School of Economics, both working on different topics related to this and other topics of North American economic history and labour history and the history of training and apprenticeship in general. Of course, which has considerable modern resonance in that the government believes in the importance of training for improving British economic performance. And there has been, as I'm sure you know, considerable controversy recently about the nature of apprenticeship in modern Britain and about what some people regard as the institution of rather diminished forms of apprenticeship, which, at least according to some people, amount to little more than training people to put things on shelves. The training that was being given in early modern London was, I think, very different from that, and I look forward, and I'm sure you look forward to hearing what Patrick and Chris have to say. They're going to do it as a double act, and I'll leave it to them to organise that.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction and the invitation to come here and speak to you tonight. In the programme, the lecture was described, I think, as on London, on history, and as unusual. I don't know quite what we did to deserve that last description, but we're hoping you'll find it interesting more than unusual. Apprenticeship is a very appropriate topic to bring here to talk about in Gresham College, because Thomas Gresham was himself an apprentice. Unusually enough, he'd also spent time at Cambridge. Very few apprentices also went to university, and his respect for university learning is apparent in the professorships which he endowed at Gresham College. But in 1535, he was apprenticed to his uncle, John Gresham. As he later explained, this was in order to obtain the practical skills that he would need as a merchant, and he was to become one of England's greatest merchants in the 16th century. As he says, I need not have been apprenticed, for that I was free by my master's copy, my father's copy, because his son was a freeman of the City of London. Albeit my father, Sir Richard Gresham, being a wise man, although I was free by his copy, he's a bit repetitive, as I am, I apologise, it was to no purpose, except I was bound prentice to the same, whereby to come by the experience and knowledge of all kinds of merchandise. The experience and knowledge, and that was what he wanted from his apprenticeship. And it's this kind of practical apprenticeship in trades as well as crafts, for sons of labourers as well as sons of merchants and sons of knights that we will discuss here tonight. Our ambition is really quite simple. What we want to do is convey some of the realities of early modern apprenticeship, realities which tend to be obscured by myths, traditions, by the residue and memories of apprenticeship as it was in the 19th and 20th century. In my case, my father was an apprentice, and his view of what apprenticeship was, I think, to me, encapsulates a vision of apprenticeship that I grew up with, of a stable, aspirational, long, settled training program with a defined job at the end of it. It was very secure. It was not easy, but it was the aspiration of a solid upper working class male. And there's a whole series of myths and assumptions about what apprenticeship was that we could think about. The idea that apprentices were always little children, vulnerable to exploitation. Here's a pauper apprentice in a 19th century textile mill. The idea that apprenticeship was, on the other hand, the nursery of the skilled working class that Ford Madox Brown encapsulates in his painting work. The idea that apprenticeship, on the other hand, was a stable, secure position in which the livery companies of London would provide some kind of institutional backing and grip to make sure that everything went okay. There we have the Cutler's Company's arms. And the opposite to that story of stability, a story of apprentices as poor mites, as exploited young children, beaten and vulnerable in the households and homes of rather nasty, exploitative masters. I mean, at this point, I always think of Oliver Twist, kind of dragged out of the workhouse, desperate not to be employed as a chimney sweep. And he succeeds at that. He's not employed as a chimney sweep. I could go on, not on Oliver Twist, he's not my special subject. But most of these myths, most of these assumptions have a grain of truth, and we'll see some of that truth later on. But the story we want to give here about apprenticeship is really rather different. Our story of apprenticeship, and we've been building it up over the last 8 to 10 years, is a story about an institution that was large, really very, very large indeed. Apprenticeship in 17th century London was bigger than the university system was until the 1980s in Britain. 1 in 10 male British teenagers came to London around 1700 to train in the city. When we say large, we mean large. That's just London, not other cities in Britain. Ours is a story about an institution that was not just large, that was flexible. What we want to tell you is a story about London apprentices who were highly mobile, who often changed their master, who often left their master, who were not tied down or subjugated. They might be beaten, but they were definitely not subjugated. And it's a story about an institution that allowed London to grow slowly into the world of wealth and relative prosperity that we enjoy now, because apprenticeship was one of the features that distinguish Europe from Asia in quite important ways. And because of this, it's an institution that helps separate Europe in the 18th and 19th century from the rest of the world. This bit we're not going to prove. We're going to speculate about this to some extent. But in India and China, if you wish to learn a skill, you learn it through either a caste, a family, or a place group. In England, as in much of the rest of Europe, as we'll show you, apprenticeship is relatively open. If you wish to learn a skill, you can obtain that skill even if your family or has no one who has that trade, even if you're not from a place where that trade is practiced, even if you need to travel hundreds of miles to acquire that trade. Now, we're not going to suggest that apprenticeship is the only ingredient for growth. We'd quite like to, but we won't. But it is an important one, and one that we would urge you to think about. Now, before we get onto this story, we should address a couple of points. Okay. The first is what apprenticeship is, just in case. Most of you are here, which implies that you have some sense of what an apprenticeship is. It's often in the news at the moment, and as Professor Flood pointed out, politicians of all stripes see in apprenticeship a way to solve the many problems of underemployed, underskilled youth. I think in the last budget, George Osborne promised to add 10,000 extra apprenticeship places in Britain. And this was a plan to generate jobs. It may work, I don't know. All apprenticeship shares a common core, and I think this is what we want to emphasize here. And this is the idea of training on the job. The idea that you gain skills through working. Often these are skills that are best, and perhaps even only can be learnt on the job. How to shape a piece of metal. How to market a piece of cloth in a market, how to deal with the turmoil of finance. But what we want to point out to you and make clear at this stage is that today's apprenticeship is a weak shadow of apprenticeship in the 17th century. Today's apprentices, well, their contract only lasts for a year or two. I was really surprised by this. The average apprenticeship now is less than 12 months. It's extraordinarily short to me. Apprentices are paid. They go to college. They live at home. They're comfortable. They're not even beaten. Now, here is the standard contract. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. I guess the key point to take home is that the vast majority of this contract is about what the apprentice shouldn't do. All right? Apprentices were utterly reliant, in most part, on their masters for food and for drink, often for clothing. They were not to gamble. They weren't to marry. They weren't to stay out to haunt playhouses, taverns, alehouses, or basically anywhere that it's fun to be as a teenager. They were rarely paid. Instead, they often paid their master to take them on in the first place. And Chris will talk about some of the amounts of money that people had to pay. And this was to last for 7 years, at least. A minimum term of 7 years that runs from the 1560s through to the 1810s. You cannot be bound for less than that. Incidentally, the word indenture, which is what this contract comes from you see the curl at the top where the actual contract has been sliced so that there's two halves of this contract, and you prove that you signed it by putting it back together to show that this is one document that you both agreed to. It's a really nice kind of proof that this actually is the contract, that you can't change the contract subsequently. Now, in return for apprentices accepting all of this, the master would feed, house, clothe, and instruct them. Now, I say instruct, there is no national curriculum here. What was to be taught, how it was taught, and when it was taught during this long 7-year term was not specified. It's never specified in English contracts. And as we will see, contracts like this are often honoured in the breach rather than the observance. But that they existed at all is something that needs some thought. And this brings me to the second point. This is the end point of the introductions in some ways. And this is the question of why apprenticeship is economically important. As Roderick said, we are economic historians. Although we're going to tell you some stories, we have to put a bit of economics in here. Because when we look at apprenticeship today, we see something that is often seen as a useful supplement to school, right? It's something that comes after school. It's something that is a way to get people's hands dirty, perhaps to deal with those kids who aren't so good at getting on at school. We want to suggest this misses something of the real elegance of apprenticeship in the past. And this is because our modern imagination encompasses a set of things that didn't exist, like technical colleges, where knowledge is formalized, like big firms that invest heavily. All of these are big training firms for modern apprentices. Like educational loans, which allow people to borrow money up front to invest in their education. These, in the pre-modern world, did not exist. None of these were there. Instead, you have small workshops where masters and apprentices exist as isolated individuals dealing with each other. Now, like today, apprenticeship is about skills. It's about what economists call human capital, which is the set of skills that you invest in and will then get some kind of income from acquiring those skills. But where it really differs is in the lack of backup institutions. There are no loans. The government's really not that interested. After making one law, it just doesn't bother with this. And there are no large firms with a big interest in their workers. Now, against this kind of backdrop, tiny workshops, isolated individuals, being able to make a contract in which your work would pay for your training is a profoundly elegant solution. Because how else can you get that training? How else can you make that investment? It cuts out the state, it cuts out money lenders, it cuts out big firms. You don't need colleges to make this work. Now, because apprenticeship relies on contracts, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about contracts, indentures, and so on, you might expect the one thing that you do need is a strong legal system to enforce contracts. And Britain, we're standing here in the centre of legal London, right? Britain is famous for its legal system. But what we're going to suggest is actually that this is wrong. That London's apprenticeship contracts were only weakly enforced. Apprenticeship in London is not a system of tight legal binding between apprentice and master. And this weakness, this flexibility, it has costs, but it has one great advantage. Apprentices could get out easily. And apprentices who can get out easily are apprentices who are likely to start. Now, if apprenticeship contracts are firmly enforced, it's a bit like agreeing to marriage as soon as you've gone on your first date. I'm willing to believe in love at first sight, but I probably would be less willing to go on a first date if that was definitely going to involve me in marriage. And this is the kind of system that we're talking about. We're talking about a system where your flexibility to date a bit, to agree that parting with your master, in this case, not your wife, I would argue against that, is a benefit. It allows you to take the chance to become an apprentice in the first place. And this flexibility has really big consequences. It means that people are willing to come and train in London. And it makes London, in that sense, it's one of the reasons why London becomes England's greatest city and Europe's greatest city. And it is, undoubtedly, by the 18th century, Europe's great city. This flexibility, this appeal to individuals drives apprentices into the city. Now, that's the background, that's the big story. What Chris is going to turn to now is the life of the apprentice, which hopefully will be a bit more, well, colourful. I think it will. Chris, come up.
So, apprenticeship is flexible. Apprenticeship was big. How do we know? So, as you may know, there's a really large literature. It's wonderful, it's colorful, it's anecdotal, tells great stories about what it was like to be an apprentice in the 18th and 19th century. Pictures, as you're seeing, give you a sense of what the experience might be like. People like Daniel Defoe were interested, so you could read The Complete English Tradesman to get an authoritative view on how things might have worked. But we're social scientists, and we might want to ask the question, well, do these stories really tell the true picture? Are these anecdotes the norm? Are they exceptional? Are they representative? Could we possibly find out? Well, thanks to the modern world, thanks to computing power, thanks to the work of historians over decades, if not centuries, thanks to the interests of amateur historians, professional historians, genealogists are wonderful for this research, we now have very large databases, which are digital, that give all kinds of wonderful information about the experience of apprenticeship. So rather than having scattered accounts, we have hundreds of thousands of accounts. Now, does the mass of data that we've collected actually support the anecdotal evidence? What stories seem to be true if we can cut through that with a statistical knife? I'll confess that I am the expert on torturing data until it confesses, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this experience has allowed us to learn so far. So let's begin at the beginning, getting started. Who are the apprentices? How did they get there? And who do they meet with and match with? I'm going to have to use this now that I've broken Patrick's thing. So the best way to start this, perhaps, is to look at a map, as I have in front of you here. Where what we've done is we've worked out what roughly are the rates of apprenticeship into London out of English counties at various points in time. If we look at the beginning of the 17th century, what's quite clear is rates are high from from places quite far away. If you were in Yorkshire and a lad, you were about as likely to end up apprenticed in London as someone from Sussex, Kent, or Essex. Now again, remember, this is a very different world to today. Transportation networks are minimal. Communication information is very limited. As Patrick described it, this is a marriage. You're going to make this date, and a long-term commitment based on someone you can't easily visit, verify, check out, have meetings with, correspond by letter or by email, or anything like that. Okay? So this is a world that drew youths from a very long distance into London. Now that's one fact. These were long-distance migrants, and that was costly and hard to reverse. The second point is, who were the apprentices? How old were they? Well, they may be a bit older than you think, certainly if you know something about apprenticeship in the 19th century. So what we find is, around 1600, the typical age of an apprentice was roughly 18 years. By 1800, that's much closer to 15. So one interesting thing is that apprentices are actually getting younger over a 2-century period. Now, overall, these apprentices are a little bit older than the standard age for apprentices in industry in the 19th and 20th century. They're also a bit older than pauper apprentices in this period. As Patrick pointed out, this is private apprenticeship in the City of London. Those who are being apprenticed under charity are a slightly different kettle of fish from that perspective. Now think about the story, the first two bits of the story I've told you. These apprentices are coming from a long way away, and you might think of them as children. Yes, they're on the cusp of teenager and early adulthood at best. Yes, so they're young, they're unfamiliar to the city. Probably the first time they come to London in many cases is when they join their master. So that begs an obvious question. How do they meet each other? How did you decide who to match with? Who helped you? How did that arrangement work out? Well, if we think about the modern world and how we might find a job, we'd probably think about the idea of social networks. Yes? That apprentices and their parents might have friends and family, and they'd use them directly to secure a place for the apprentice for their child. We might also think about neighbors, connections with people we know from back home. Yes, these apprentices have all migrated to London from a long distance. Many of the masters who they might train with did as well. Perhaps those local connections help you source an appropriate boy or something like that. We could also think about the old boys club in some sense, might be used to advance the cause. Now, if we think about how philosophers, social scientists have thought about how you might find a job before industrialization, their story has often been one that these types of channels were very important. So if I could gently paraphrase John Stuart Mill, he wrote that jobs prior to industrialization were almost equivalent to an hereditary distinction of caste, with each employment being chiefly recruited from the children of those already employed in it. The idea, it's hereditary. Who gets the jobs or the placements? Those with connections. It's, you might think, a dynastic world, where those who have prospered can easily pass on that prosperity to their children. Now, given that we're so fortunate to have all this wonderful evidence, we could actually ask the question, if we look at London apprentices in the period we're interested in, do we see most of them actually possessing these types of connections? We were actually able to do that, which is really neat. And the answer is perhaps quite surprising. So when we actually try to answer some of Mill's questions, address his idea, we actually look for evidence of direct social ties between apprentices and their masters. About 30,000, so a big number, right? Lots of anecdotes put together to tell the story. What do we find? We find actually surprisingly little evidence of these connections. So if we say, first, for example, is the master known to be kin? Often that would be information would emerge through the indenture contract. Sometimes we try to get that information using what we know about the names. Yes, that comes out to somewhere between 5 and 10%. Now, a bigger potential connection would be geographical. Does a master come from the same place, roughly defined as you? Do they come from the same county, given that most of these masters are also migrants? The answer is no. Roughly 20% might come from the same county. That's more than you'd expect by chance, but certainly doesn't explain most of the placements. The typical apprentice was a migrant to London, training with a master who was also a migrant, but from somewhere else. Okay, that's the mode, if you will. So these sort of easily observable connections don't seem to explain most of the matches that happen. Now you might think, well, that's not the main important connection. It's really what your father does that matters, yes? They're in the same business. Therefore, they have an informal or formal network that would connect them to the master in London. We could also ask that question because these indenture contracts typically say what the father does. So, if we look at this, what do we find? We find that actually a minority of apprentices have fathers in a similar line of business to their master. So if we look at the share of fathers who are broadly speaking in the manufacturing sector, for metropolitan apprentices, it accounts for a little under half. Okay, so not the majority, but important. But that's just thinking about metropolitan apprentices, those who are actually from London in the first place. What about if we think about those migrants, right? Those for whom connections to the city, however they could generate them, would be much more important. There, the story is really interesting and quite different. Sure, lots of them also come from manufacturing background, but the largest, most dominant father background is the primary sector, farming, agriculture. Yes? Most apprentices are the children of fairly well-off yeomen and the like. We also see a large fraction of gentlemen in the distribution of migrant apprentices. About 1 in 6 come from these types of backgrounds. So there's a story about whether apprenticeship was spurned and avoided by the gentry. That's quite clearly not the case on the lines of the evidence that we've produced. So, in sum, you might say London apprenticeship was the nursery of the provincial and rural skilled artisans, the middle class, and the elite. If you look at these pictures and you look, for example, at how many come from a laboring background, that's really quite rare and uncommon. So it's pretty clear that this was not an outlet for the truly poor or the unskilled working class. Okay? Training with a London master was an appealing option for lots of parents if they had the means, and especially appealing, as we found in some of our other research, for second sons, those that won't inherit the estate, as it were. Okay. Now, why do we have this particular social profile, which is an interesting thing to think about? And here the story has a lot to do with the costs. So first of all, now, while apprentices, while they're working, are in some sense, working for their master, I should say, are in some sense repaying the cost of their training through their work, it's also true that they're sacrificing a lot of income in this time period. If you follow up with a 7-year indenture, that's 7 years out of the paid labor market, only receiving sustenance. That might be hard for you to swallow. It might be even harder for your family to absorb that loss, especially if you're of modest means. Now, in addition to that, as Patrick mentioned, many, in fact, we think most apprentices also paid a cash premium to their master before training. Okay, so before you begin your course with a master, you hand over a sum of money. This is very interesting. Historians know these exist. They have very wide-ranging estimates of how big they were. We found a fantastic source that we could actually get a sense, a really good sense, what this might look like. Now, the answer is it varies a lot by the type of occupation you might enter. Suppose you want to become a grocer. How much would you pay to the master normally? About £100. Is that a lot of money in 1700? Oh, yes. Incomes for unskilled workers, roughly £12 per year. So only those who really have capital from their families could afford to enter into that type of occupation. What about somewhere lower down the type of activities that apprentices might enter? Let's say into plastering or skilled crafts. There, the typical premium was in the area of £5 or £6, okay, so more affordable, and many apprentices in lower-end trades didn't pay a premium at all. Okay, so for a more hands-on craft, apprenticeship would be difficult for the relatively poor, but perhaps not impossible. Now, that's £5 against a £12 income sounds like a lot of money. It is. And if you actually do a little comparison to today, it kind of rings a bell. So if you compare a premium you would pay to enter into apprenticeship relative to income in 1700, and suppose you compare that to the tuition fees as of next year, to attend university for a year, the LSE is charging £500 less than this, and compare that to median annual income, the ratios look roughly similar, which is kind of a neat thing to show. But don't forget that it's also going to be more difficult in 1700 to pay that burden than it would be in 2000. As Patrick mentioned, today we have a private credit market that students could use to access funds for loans to pay for their fees. The state helps you out. In 1700, neither of those was in place to provide the same sort of assistance. So that's quite clearly a significant burden. So, in sum, the high cost of apprenticeship meant that it was really an activity pursued by the children of the provincial elite, although, as I said, they rarely had connections to the companies and masters that they served. So apprenticeship brought new blood to the city, but it was mainly rich new blood. Now, hopefully you're asking yourself the next most obvious question. Well, if these social ties didn't seem so important, how on earth did masters and apprentices find one another? That's a big puzzle. It's a puzzle we don't have completely resolved, but we can appeal now back to the quotes and to the anecdotes, tell you stories. So the best one we have that we found so far is Daniel Clark. It's the story of Francis Clark, his son, who sought an apprenticeship with the help of friends, as he said, seeking a freeman and one that dealt considerably in his way of trade and was a fair dealing man. There are other smaller, less detailed extracts about how people might use an intermediary to try to find a placement for their son or for their nephew or something like that. So clearly, family matters and connections are important, but it's one step removed from the master and the parents having a direct face-to-face relationship. That direct relationship is still surprisingly common if you look at youths entering employment for the first time in their lives in Canada today, in Britain today. Often the employer and the parent know each other personally. Here, they are at least 1 degree from that, which we think is quite neat and an interesting finding. our overall message from this is that the pattern of recruitment and placement we see looks a lot like how social scientists would describe a modern market. It's impersonal exchange. You don't have to know the person you're dealing with, and they're relatively anonymous. Now, how such a market came to exist in the City of London several hundred years ago is a great question, and it's fascinating food for thought. So that's how you got started in apprenticeship. What happened next? So once the master was found, the fees were paid, the indenture was signed, then you could begin your apprenticeship. Now, typically you're looking at a 7-year term. That's a long time. It's a long time in anyone's life. Imagine you're age 17 or 16 in London, which is dirty, dark, dangerous, all those things. Yes? What have you signed yourself up to? Now, the traditional interpretation is something like this, that if the apprentice survived the strains of living in London, the length of the indenture was arranged so the master could extract his pound of flesh from an unpaid assistant. I will train you, and I'll take that fee at the beginning, thank you. Now you're going to work for me and repay the rest. Yes? Now, some historians have asked whether masters, given this arrangement, would actually have much interest in providing what we think of as training. Yes? And if we think of various accounts, they often emphasize that apprentices were often assigned menial tasks in the master's workshop and received precious little direct instruction. Patrick's going to tell you a bit later about court cases where often that's one of the main complaints is, he didn't tell me how to do the job. Now, this view of apprenticeship could hold if the rules governing apprenticeship were actually enforced to the letter of the law. But were they? A very good question to ask, a hard one to answer, but we have some neat partial evidence on this story. So what we've done is we've used household evidence from tax records together with livery company information to try to open a window into how training actually took place. As you'll see, it's a small, limited window, but still it's yielded at least 2 really important, striking findings. Now, the first one is, what happened over the 7 years? Was the apprentice stuck in the master's workshop, toiling away until death or eventual release? We think the answer is almost certainly not. So we've actually used this evidence to try to figure out something about the extent and a little bit indirectly about the nature of attrition. And one very clear finding is lots of the apprentices aren't where they're supposed to be. Okay? Presence rates are well below 100% at any point in time, and there also seems to be a clear pattern of decline over the expected term. Okay? So we start at the beginning. One of the first facts we find is that apprentices arrive slowly. Over the first few years of the indenture, a larger share than average are absent. We also find in the same scope that some apprentices are there before the term is supposed to begin. Now that's an interesting finding and also consistent with the idea that many serve trial periods in the city. They would stay with their master, they could stay on their master's liking and sign an indenture once they've proven themselves to be a reliable potential employee, a reliable potential apprentice. Now, following perhaps a trial period for some, slow arrival for others, we find that many also quit early over the first 3 years of the term. Again, this decline over the beginning of the indenture can't really be fully explained by death or other types of events where you might be turned over to another master. It also can't really be explained easily by things like, it turns out we have a bad match. We don't get along, therefore we'll dissolve the relationship early. It doesn't take 3 years normally to figure that part out. Yes? So what we think almost certainly is that some apprentices would stay and train for several years and then choose to opt out, probably having no intention to stay till the end in the first place anyway. Now, by 3 years into the indenture contract, about half of them, a bit more, are gone from apprenticeship, but those who are there pretty much tend to stay. Okay? So if you've made it to 3 years, why not go all the way and get what's there for you at the end? And then finally, those who do stay till the end, for the most part, leave when they should. Okay? Now, so that's the story of attrition. It's lots of apprentices are not there. Oops, I'll come to Benjamin Bangs later. Sorry about that. That's the story of attrition. Lots of apprentices are missing, and there's a clear stylized pattern over the life cycle of when they're absent and when they're present. Now, that's a neat pattern to tell you about. Then you might want to ask, well, why is that happening? Is the sort of story I told you have some coherence? Well, here we actually tried to analyze the causes of attrition, and we found a distinctive pattern that we think reveals something very interesting about the underlying motivation for training with early departure. Consider two groups. The first group would be migrant apprentices, so those young people coming from the provinces from relatively prosperous families, the gentlemen's sons, those from the wealthiest farmers. They're actually the most likely apprentices to leave early. Okay? This makes sense if you consider the opportunities available to them outside of the livery companies. Their fathers were wealthy. Their fathers were connected, but not in London, back home. A training period in London could provide new skills for the family business, could extend the family's commercial network, their contact books. Okay? So for those apprentices, taking the skills back home would be extremely attractive and perhaps an unavoidable temptation, our results would suggest. On the other end of the spectrum, London-born apprentices of modest origins were the least likely to leave an indenture. So poor boys had weak possibilities outside the guilds. This was their best shot in life, as it were. And if they were poor and from London in the first instance, there was no hometown comforts to which they could return. Now, these findings don't explain why masters allow their apprentices to leave. After all, it's hard to imagine any entrepreneur worth his salt turning down 7 years of unpaid labor. That sounds too good to say no to. In some instances, of course, the apprentice may have been so unproductive that the master was happy to lock them out. In economic terms, this means that what the apprentice provided to the business in terms of his labor was less than the cost of keeping them. Where the apprentice initiated departure, the payment of a premium, yes, might be the condition that allowed the apprentice to leave. So that may be a large underlying contributing factor to the flexibility we've documented. Now, our key discovery is that most apprentices were not bound by their indentures as implied by the letter of their law. Both apprentices and masters would know in advance there was a high likelihood they would separate before the 7 years were up. In many cases, the early departure, we think, almost certainly was agreed in advance by both parties. They knew this would happen, and they probably agreed a premium, assuming it would happen. In some cases, the threat of departure might actually have motivated the master to spend more time training the apprentice than otherwise, and Patrick's going to provide some hints as to why that will be in a few minutes. Of course, many apprentices did still complete their terms and went on to acquire citizenship and eventually train the odd apprentice of their own in London. But this was only one training pathway sought by prospective apprentices, right? It was a training model that provided more than one route to success. It was a way into the guilds and into that career, but for others, also a way to acquire skill, even if you had no intention of pursuing a career in the city. To illustrate the surprising flexibility of the system, let's end my part of the talk with the story of good old Benjamin Bangs, the most flexible apprentice we've seen yet. So he was initially bound in Long of Norfolk for an unusual term of 5 years, that's a bit funny in itself, for a fee of £5. Now his master went belly up, insolvent after 1 year. What happened next? Bangs moved on to London and found a new master who, upon seeing him, was very willing to take me. After 3 years in London, as Bangs says, I understood my business pretty well and was a little ambitious in my mind to become a master of it. Therefore, after I left him, I got into the company of the best workmen. So Bangs has a very flexible training life. Yes, he leaves his first master after a year, moves up to the big smoke or the big stink, maybe we call it, when Bangs was training in London, to a new master, and seems to also move to a new group in the final year. Yes, he moved around, he retrained, he moved up the ladder, as it were. Okay, so this anecdote, it's back to the anecdotes again, but we think it's a good illustration of the possibilities that our statistical analysis suggests were possible. It's an interesting example, perhaps not an unusual one. And with that, I'll hand you over to Patrick to finish the talk.
Thanks, Chris. There are some things, given this is the City of London, that you might expect to have heard about by now. In particular, you might expect to have heard about the city's guilds, or its livery companies, and you might have expected to hear about the city's own governing body, the corporation. Now, London's livery companies are important here. They helped make London apprenticeship what it was. In particular, they came up with the idea of a 7-year term, in part to keep apprentices out rather than to keep them in. This kind of self-interest in some ways informs what many of the livery companies were doing. However, they did do 3 things which were, we think, very beneficial. Sorry, I've got that slide. Some nice pictures of city and girls. The first thing they did was they registered apprentices. They were a great body for recording details of apprentices as they enter and as they exit. They provide a basis on which contracts could be disputed. The second thing they do is provide arbitration for disputes between apprentices and masters. How fairly they do this is a matter of some question. This is an apprentice who accused his master of various ill-mannered actions. The company found, in this case the barber surgeons found, company thought, well, that's not right. So they decided to whip him as punishment. Unsurprisingly, he fell on his knees then and submitted himself to their judgment and blamed someone else for coming up with these ideas. So as well as arbitration, finally, some companies impose masterpieces to test the quality of training that apprentices receive. Now, these aren't imposed by all companies, but some do, and they, as well, become very important. They provide a way of establishing skill, and they also provide a way of limiting access to the company. Note this, that this is from the Goldsmiths Company, who in 1607 ordered that no one should be suffered to keep shop until he could start and finish his masterpiece unaided. And this is because they worry about the true practice of the art and mystery not being grown into great decay and dispersed into many parts. So this masterpiece system is a system for quality, undoubtedly, but also a system for control. And this combination of quality and control is one of the big contributions of the livery companies. So livery companies were important, but their role should not be exaggerated. Most apprentices would only see the inside of a guild hall when they were recorded and written into these books in the first place. Fewer than half apprentices would ever become freemen, and as Chris showed you, many would have long gone from their masters before even 3 or 4 years were elapsed. The feasts and the entertainments and much of the actual information that was gathered by livery companies were for their freemen, not for the apprentices. What did the city do, though? Well, here the story gets a bit odder, because London is unique. London has a really important role in apprenticeship in the city, but it's not one you'd expect. The City of London provides the divorce court of apprenticeship. I know, it's rather a shock. It's a shock to me when I found it out. But in the Lord Mayor's Court, not a minor court, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 apprentices in the city would turn up, show their indentures, and be discharged. Have their indenture essentially torn up. This is a remarkably large number, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 apprentices, who would, rivaling divorce until the 1960s, and they would only need to go to this court if they couldn't agree terms, right? This is only when they could dispute, when they had a dispute with their master. The court becomes so popular, they have little printed forms where they just fill in the details, and at the end it says they're discharged, right? So it's remarkable. And the Mayor's Court is acting in a remarkable way. And remember, this is the Lord Mayor. The Lord Mayor is discharging these people, not in this case, but most of them, 80% of these cases, 4 in 5, are discharged because they didn't enroll their contract with the city chamberlain. They didn't take the bit of paper to the city chamberlain and have it written into the city's books. It's a bit like getting divorced because you signed your name in the wrong color ink, right? Now, not all of the things that go on behind this were happy partings. Many weren't, and from a different bit of the court, we get some sense of the impressions of the events that might lead up to a breakdown and to a dispute and to a discharge. Some of these stories are quite colourful, and they give you a different sense of apprenticeship. So in 1691, the apprentice John Coates was accused by his master of being lavish and profuse in his expenditures, of taking out monies from Till's box or till, of pawning 2 pictures from his house, taking goods from his shop, and, of course, obtaining a quantity of brandy. Now, Till, in this case, refuses to confess, but took his hat and went on his ways and entered on board a man of war, which I think, if you think about that line that Chris showed you earlier of various people departing at various points, you've got to put going to sea as one of the things that you would definitely do if you're a 20-year-old who doesn't like his boss. Now, there are various worse stories that we could go on with, but apprentices weren't the only people who abused apprentices didn't only abuse their masters, masters abused their apprentices. Here's a poulter master who's called Thomas Spratley. Nice name, Thomas Spratley. Reminds me of fish somehow. He's accused of neglecting his apprentices, of letting him go till he was ragged, hardly had any shoes to his feet, and persons cried out shame of him, wondering that the master would let his apprentice go in such a manner. The apprentice, and this is why I like it, became very lousy and nasty, such that the lice may be seen crawling on his skin. This is a witness in an apprentice divorce case. You clearly have to be able to see what's gone wrong. Now, such stories of violence and neglect abound, but what needs to be recalled is not just that abuse and violence occurred in apprenticeships, but that this is a society in which violence is much more common than it is today, but that apprentices who were mistreated brought lawsuits to the Mayor of London to get out of their contract. Apprenticeships might sometimes turn into violent, sordid, unhappy affairs, but when they did, the city, the Lord Mayor, offers them a way out. Apprentices were not shackled to their masters in the way that Victorian wives were locked into unhappy marriages. Far from it. Indeed, at this point, my analogy, which I keep coming back to with modern divorce, becomes useful. For as often happens in a messy divorce, those accusations, these stories of violence that I briefly passed over, occurred during lawsuits about who should get what money after an apprenticeship had broken down. So the really nasty accusations about apprenticeship, they're about the money. This is San Francisco, this is LA in that sense. I don't know why I think of bad divorces in America. Never mind. So at this point, we should bring our lecture to a close. For all these stories of industry and idleness, as Hogarth entitled his famous series of prints about apprenticeship, apprenticeship made London the country's greatest technical university in the 17th and 18th century. It was an immense system, as I hope we've shown you. It was also an important one that was vital to the city's economy. But how it worked was surprising and seems counterintuitive to many people. For apprenticeship was not by the book. It didn't follow the rules. It brought together people who didn't know each other. It brought together an unconnected group of masters and apprentices into relationships that were long and sometimes stable, sometimes not. It was a system in which formal rules and regulations were not the source of apprenticeship success. Instead, apprentices get round the formal rules when it made sense to. Now, the implications of this for London's development were in themselves massive. Apprenticeship fed the city with the people it needed to grow, for London was an easy place to die and a hard place to live. It transmits skills between generations, and it sustains an economy in which knowledge could spread beyond family. It meant that you did not just train your children into your own art. And this, in some ways, is a surprisingly open economy, in fact. It's an economy which is almost as open as ours looks like it is today. It's not open in all respects. There are few opportunities for women. If you're a member of the indigent poor, then you're out of luck, as you are in many ways today. But it was a system that allows London to become England's greatest industrial and commercial hub, and that, it along the way, gave Thomas Gresham some of the skills he needed to become a wealthy philanthropist, and endow this college is another thing to be grateful for. So I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. We have 5-10 minutes for questions. And we have a roving microphone for those who are interested in asking a question. While Lauren is taking it to somebody, let me ask one. Where did the apprentices go when they finished their training? Did most of them leave London and go back again? I mean, the ones who actually completed their training. And is the argument, therefore, that London is acting as a kind of training ground for the rest of the country?
I think that's part of the story. It's very hard to tell. The problem with the early modern society is there's very few telephone directories. But where we can find these people, we do find some of them going back home to their villages. We find something like 1 in 10 marrying in the village that they came from in the countryside. So that seems to imply that quite a few are going back. Some clearly going to the Navy and places like that. Some just slipping into the suburbs, where you could work without completion. So they seem to be spreading all over. But part of this is a story where you would come to London, and then if you have a better opportunity, you will go back home, and you will use the skills from this hub of excellence in terms of knowledge and connections in business, and you will bring those back to wherever it is you're from and use them there.
You said that there were few opportunities for women. I can see that there were possibly informal opportunities, but were there any formal opportunities at all?
There were some formal opportunities, but I forget the exact percentage. It's about
a few hundred women out of several 100,000.
Yes, we have a big. Thanks to Cliff Webb, who is the most industrious and wonderful man I've ever met, we have a list of about 300,000 London apprentices from this period, and a few hundred are women. A few doing what? By the 18th century, we do see them training in as milliners in a few trades related to clothing and textiles, where you might see particular associations. You do see a few pauper apprentices do end up being trained in housewifery, which is little more, I think, than scullery work. You don't seem to see women in the 17th and 18th century training in skilled crafts such as brewing or metalwork and so on, which are traditionally male jobs. So it's a very limited access and a limited range of trades that we observe.
And their masters are women as well, for the few hundred we see.
Yes, quite a lot are training with female masters, particularly when they're milliners, because often in London you have men and women pursuing different occupations, and if that woman has a shop, then they might take on an apprentice.
That's right.
I was quite surprised to hear that it was an upper middle class activity as well as sort of lower middle or even lower. Why would an upper middle class young man be sent to an apprenticeship when I had an idea that they probably might have gone to university? Was it like today that perhaps the less clever and the more sort of technically he's good with his hands sort of person would have gone into an apprenticeship, whereas his older brother would have gone to study the classics?
I mean, I like to imagine that there are a fair number of Tim Nice but Dim types in here. But when we really look at the elite, those people who are coming from wealthy landed families, the real country gentry, and we do find them here, we find that if you're the third or fourth son, you're quite likely to end up in London. If you're the first and second, then you'll go to university or the Inns of Court. So there's a clear sense that as you move down the birth order, as you become less and less likely to inherit, then trade becomes quite important. But remember, apprenticeship is the way into becoming a merchant, to becoming a plutocrat. If you wanted to train into early modern Europe's Morgan Stanleys, you became an apprentice.
Exactly.
If you wanted to become a lawyer for many kinds of legal work, you would become an apprentice to a lawyer. By the 18th century, we see that a lot. If you want to become a surgeon, you become an apprentice. So it's only very limited groups of professions require a university training. So really, a large level, many of the richest jobs in the country would have required an apprenticeship, as well as the poorest.
If I may, just one other terribly quick question. A lot of sort of popular songs of this period talk about the apprentice eventually marrying the master's daughter. And I've come across that so many times, I wondered if you'd noticed if that was a real or a romantic idea.
We don't have any detailed evidence on that because, sadly for London, marriage is not terribly consistently recorded. It certainly does happen, but we've got a lot of apprentices, not that many masters, and hence not that many daughters. So I like to think that it's a way into some kind of business partnerships. It does happen, but it's never going to be a big way out, unless too many daughters unfortunately would die or not exist. So yes.
Is there anything that sets aside London's apprenticeships from those available in the other great cities of Europe? And to that end, is there any evidence for people travelling from abroad for apprenticeships in London?
Good to hear from you. There are differences. In London, these apprenticeships actually tend to be longer than on the continent. So in Paris or Antwerp, or in German cities, you're often training for 2, 3, 4 years. And one of the things that we see, remember that curve of attrition that Chris showed you, is we see what looks a bit like a continental apprenticeship where you'll stay for 2 or 3 years to train, and then if you just want the skill, you'll leave. So in some ways, our story makes London apprenticeship in practice look a bit like continental apprenticeship. But because the system of rules and institutions that London has created is built around this long 7-year apprenticeship, the institutions of apprenticeship in London are quite different. London's also got a different role for its country than, say, Paris or Antwerp would have, because London is such a mega city in England's own experience. London is vastly too big for England. And as a result, it's absorbing such a large slice of society into apprenticeship that this, I think, is qualitatively really quite different. When you have 1/10 of all English teenagers coming here to train, that makes London different, qualitatively different. It's a mixing pot, it's a melting pot for a nation, and in some senses probably has implications for how England develops as a country, as well as for its economy and for the city's economy in itself.
Thank you. Is there any analysis of religious background, in particular Jews versus Anglicans versus non-conformists?
We haven't carried that out, and I'm not sure that it's something that one would be able to. They do have to take oaths, which rules out some groups of non-conformists. I've never come across any commentary on whether or not access via for Catholics is limited. Certainly by the late 17th century, when you have a discussion of trade and business in London, there is a lot of activity. There's a large significance for non-conformists, for people who are not members of the Church of England, that is. And so many of those must have been apprentices, but we haven't got any information on whether, if you're a non-conformist, you then train with a non-conformist master or anything. I would expect that to be the case, because it would be pretty difficult to be in a staunch Anglican household and to be going out to the meeting house. But we don't know about that, I'm afraid. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Do you have any analysis of how many indentures were outside the livery system? Because I mean, because I know, especially women who are milliners, mantua makers, people like that. I mean, there's no obvious company that they may have been related to.
No, indeed. And we aren't really able to talk about that in any detail yet. For the 18th century, we can speculate a bit where in London, at that point, in Greater London, you start to get quite large numbers outside of the livery system. But I don't really have a proportion to hand, and I think actually we haven't yet managed to measure it properly, so I would hesitate. But certainly by the 18th century, quite a lot is happening outside of the city's companies, in part because the city itself is now so much bigger than the old corporate square mile.
So the numbers is hard, but we see people paying taxes on premiums who are in the suburbs, or so there is. We know they're there, but how many there are, what the ratio is to the city apprentices,
we don't know.
We don't know that. That's a good question as well.
Do we have any idea of how many apprentices are with the master at a time, on average?
We do. Generally, there's actually a rule limiting you to 2 or less. In fact, the vast majority of masters only ever take 1 apprentice in their career. But there are some masters who seem to make a speciality of training. And because they specialize in it and take continually large numbers of apprentices, keeping towards their maximum, they actually account for a very large slice of apprentices. Yep. So most masters only train 1 person, but most apprentices are trained with masters who will have 2 or 3 apprentices at a time, and in some senses are, in that sense, running quite large firms, at least in London terms. Yeah.
Perhaps one more after this one, yes.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about that answer you gave a moment ago about indentures that were not connected with livery companies. And my understanding was that the livery companies or the guilds had an area within which it might be 3 miles or 5 miles or 15 miles. And if you wanted to trade as a master or train as an apprentice, you had to be a member of that guild. You couldn't do it unless you were. So it was So
Yes,
in
I'm
my
afraid-
view, it was quite cut and dried.
Yes, I'm afraid in legal terms it's absolutely cut and dried. But like many, many laws in the 17th century, the reality is somewhat less clear than the law would imply. And certainly by the 18th century, fewer and fewer companies are exercising those rights. And as a company decides not to bother to search to try and exercise this monopoly right, then it becomes less and less important to have trained within it. So this gradual weakening of company control, which is something that is still not clearly mapped out, creates windows of opportunity in which people can train outside of the company. And that's certainly what we see.
Can I just sort of make an observation relating to your opening comments, right?
Yes.
Comment. Right at the very beginning, you said apprenticeship is what differentiates London from any other city.
Well, for Europe from Asia.
I'm sorry,
actually.
Europe from Asia. And I was thinking about that as you said it, and I thought, but I mean, the earliest guilds in London, not that long ago, I mean, 12th, 11th, 12th
Yes.
century. But there were guilds in China as long ago as 2,500 years.
Yes, but the Chinese guilds are not like Western guilds. Chinese guilds are based around common places. So a Chinese guild is a guild of people from Doncaster who work in London, right? Which is not what we're talking about. That's not a guild of cutlers. That's a group from a particular place who work then in a different city. So that's a very different kind of organization, and that's why one of the implications is that you've got limited skill transmission. And that underlines that statement. But apprenticeship is not a product of the guilds. Apprenticeship stands before the guild exists, it survives after the guild's decline, which is why it survives today, while the livery companies now do very good work for training, but aren't regulating apprenticeship.
I think we should draw to an end, as usual, with about an hour. So may I, on your behalf, thank Patrick and Chris very much for a fascinating talk, which, among other things, illustrates the extent to which economic history, our subject, has become something dependent on very large databases, large infrastructure, and therefore needs a lot of money. So thank you for demonstrating that.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.